So 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 17. Then David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. And he told them to teach the children of Judah the song of the bow. Indeed, it is written in the book of Jasher. The beauty of Israel is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice. Lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew nor rain upon you, nor fields of offerings, for the shield of the mighty is cast away there, the shield of Saul, not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan was slain in your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me, and your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. Amen. Death is always the unwelcome guest. It always leaves an empty void in our lives. And so we ask ourselves the question this morning as we come to this passage in 2 Samuel, how should we grieve? How do we grieve well? You see, I think what we can see from the outset of this passage this morning, and maybe you picked it up as we went through the passage, that grief is always an appropriate response to death. You know, death might be one of those few certainties of life. We know that one day we are all going to die. That is a certainty of life. But that does not mean that death is natural. It does not mean that death was meant to be. And I don't really think that, to a sense, death is something we ever truly come to terms with. You know, if you ask anyone, maybe you yourself this morning have lost someone. I don't think we ever truly come to terms with the loss, do we? The emptiness that death leaves behind. It just never goes away. And so really, as we come to death and as we think about death, death should silence us. You know, what do you say to a dying relative or friend? How do you console a grieving family? Often there isn't anything to say, is there? You sit in silence, you sit next to somebody, you listen to what they have to say. You see, the truth is, as Christians, we know that the Bible gives us all the answers that we need. But the thing is, it doesn't give us all the answers we would like. And that is why I think we find it difficult to respond to death, to loss. Maybe that is why we find it difficult sometimes to know how to grieve well. And so for this reason, I think the passage we have before us this morning is worth spending time in. And that is why I wanted to split this chapter into two. Because this is David's response to the death of not only Saul, but the death of Jonathan. And I think as we go through these verses, we'll see, in a sense, an example of what grief looks like. An example, perhaps, of how we could mourn, how we should mourn. perhaps it also gives us a direction for our sorrow and our grief. And so this morning I want to invite us into this story. I think it is the only way that we truly get a sense of what is going on here. We get a sense of the deep loss that David is feeling. And for that we'll need to bear in mind 1 Samuel 31. We'll need to bear in mind 2 Samuel chapter 1, the beginning section we looked at last week. But I think really to understand this lament to its fullest extent, we need to feel the weight of grief and loss that David experiences. Now, Hebrew poetry uses imagery, and we have to try and grapple with some of that imagery to really understand what's going on. But truthfully, from last week, we remember this Amalekite appears before David. David has no idea what has gone on that battlefield. And here is the recorded poetry of David's lament. And you see, as David weeps, he not only weeps for the whole situation, for the whole battle, for all of that has gone on. He not only weeps for the fact that many people have fled and many are dead. This is a specific mourning for King Saul and his best friend Jonathan. Isn't it striking? I don't know if you picked this up as we went through. Isn't it striking that David does not rejoice that his enemy Saul has died? There is not one single moment in this lament where David expresses joy at Saul's death. And interestingly, this isn't a private lament. This isn't a private grief. Verse 18. We read, he also required this lament to be taught to all the people. This was a tragedy on a national scale. And yet, even though it is not private, it is deeply personal. It is deeply personal, as we'll see in a moment. Just imagine standing on Mount Gilboa. Just imagine standing there where this battle had taken place and where this tragedy had occurred. Just imagine standing in that spot and saying, here marks the spot where the Lord's anointed fell. Here lies the spot where his shield lies covered in mud and his sword abandoned without an owner. Here marks the spot where the Lord's enemies had apparent victory. And you see, for Israel, all the hopes and dreams of Israel that would have been found in King Saul as he came to power and as the people requested a king like all the other nations, all the hopes and dreams of Israel now lie scattered across this battlefield. For the people have fled, many are dead, and so is Saul and Jonathan. But you see, David doesn't just say that this lament should be taught, does he? David wants this lament to be known. Known in the immediate, known down through history. For we read there that it is to be found in the book of Jasher. Maybe you don't know anything about that book. There'd be good reason for that because it doesn't exist anymore. It's lost. No one knows where it is. But in Israel, this would have been a significant book. And there amongst the pages of songs and poetry from Israel's greats of the past would be David's lament over Saul and Jonathan. Now, we don't have that book available to us. We don't know what else was in that book. But we do have David's lament preserved for us here in 2 Samuel. And so David has 3 reasons for his grief that we're going to look at briefly this morning. Verses 19 to 21. The mighty have fallen. As we've already said, this is a tragedy on a national scale, and David is concerned for the whole nation of Israel. This is something that is going to affect the whole of Israel. And David's first reason for his grief is that the mighty have fallen in tragic ways. Just look down there at verse 19. The beauty of Israel. Actually, the Hebrew is better translated as the ornament or the gazelle, a picture of beauty and glory, has been slain on the hillside. And David explains the reason why he says that, because the mighty have fallen. That phrase, the mighty have fallen, is used 3 times throughout this lament. This is clearly David's big point about this lament, that the mighty have fallen. That is why this is such a great tragedy. And it is interesting to explore the meaning of that phrase and why David uses it, because I think this does really capture the horror of this tragedy. They were mighty, but now they have fallen. You see, our sadness, David's sadness, is because he experiences a sense of that which was lost. Israel's glory, Israel's beauty lies slain on the hillside. And therefore David says, weep over what has been lost, because the mighty have fallen in tragic ways. And you see, that leaves David with 2 great longings that he expresses here in these verses. Firstly, that there should be no joy in the enemy camp. We see that in verse 20. And secondly, that there should be no joy found in that place of tragedy. You see, the Philistines had victory over the Lord's anointed, or apparent victory, at least in this moment. And if you remember from 1 Samuel 31, they decapitated his body. They pinned it up on a wall as a trophy of their success. This is big news in the enemy camp. And David cannot bear the thought of the Lord's enemies rejoicing over this man's death. Interestingly, he uses the words Gath and Ashkelon. If you know anything about the history, the geography of Israel, they are, or the area, they are basically polar opposites of the Philistine camp. And so what David is saying is, I want complete silence across the whole Philistine camp. From the furthest point at Gath to the furthest point of Ashkelon, there should be no rejoicing in the enemy camp. May no one go in and tell them what has happened on that hillside. May there be no breaking news on Philistine TV. May there be no rejoicing over or celebrating over this tragedy anywhere in that land. And what is David's main reason for this longing for silence? Well, it is because Saul has fallen. It is because Jonathan has fallen. But there's more. If we dig beneath the surface, we see an even greater reason why David wants silence, why he wants no rejoicing in that land. Because he does not want the uncircumcised that he mentions there at the end of verse 20. He does not want the uncircumcised to triumph. The uncircumcised basically means those who do not belong to God, those who do not belong to Israel. He does not want it known in that moment that the Lord's enemies have had victory. See, David is concerned primarily here for the Lord's reputation. You see, he knew that this loss would give great reason to rejoice if you were a Philistine. Secondly, not only does David long for silence, he longs that there is no joy to be found in that tragic place. Just look down there, verse 21. Isn't it interesting? It almost feels like he's speaking directly to the mountain itself. O mountains of Gilboa, how can life carry on as normal in that tragic place? The good things that come upon that land should not continue as if nothing had happened. There should be no dew upon that land. There should be no rain. There should be no crops permitted to grow in that place. Do you not understand the great loss that has happened in this place? Isn't that one of the perhaps biggest tragedy, the biggest pains that death brings for us, for anyone? That the world seems to go on as if nothing has happened. You've experienced great loss. Perhaps your world has come crumbling in as you've experienced the loss of a loved one. And yet the world and creation just seems to carry on as if nothing had happened. And so we're reminded again, aren't we, that death isn't natural. And it is the last great enemy that we will face. And this lament reminds us that the pain of death is real. Let's not sugarcoat it. It is real. And David puts his agony into words as he writes verse 21. What is the reason for that tragedy? For the shield of the mighty is cast away, and the shield of Saul is not anointed with oil. We do need to hit just the pause button just briefly, just to try and understand what's going on here, what David is trying to say as he uses that imagery. This is a deeply tragic image that we see here as David writes. This is a deeply agonizing way for David to express what is going on. This word mighty that's used actually all the way through this text, it's actually found in the plural, which does give that indication that he's talking about the whole thing. But here very clearly, there is one particular shield that David is interested in. Saul's shield, once primed and ready for battle, has now been cast away. It now lies on the ground, battered, covered in mud, perhaps even covered in blood, cast away without an owner, not fit for purpose. In those days, shields would have been covered in leather and then covered in oil. The reason being, it stops people grabbing hold of them. It maybe helps the arrows to ricochet off because it's a slippery surface. Now all that we see is a shield that is no longer covered with oil. Rather, it is covered with dirt. Maybe it's even a picture that the Lord's anointed is now no longer anointed. The one to whom God raised up is the one to whom God has brought down. The one who disobeyed God is now finally rejected by God, and he lays slain on a hillside. See, that image of that battlefield is a stark reminder, isn't it? It's a graphic reminder of all of this. It's a graphic reminder of the pain that David is experiencing. Just imagine if we were in a film scene. Maybe you'd have the flyover camera go over Mount Gilboa. There's no need for music. The emotion is captured just simply in the image that you see. Body after body, shields after shields, swords scattered, and the tragic reminder of the end of Saul. Nothing but silence. There's nothing to say. But you know what? David clearly points out that the loss of Saul, the man, is a big tragedy. But there's a bigger tragedy, isn't there? There's a greater tragedy. And that is seen in what might have been. Do you remember back in 1 Samuel 13, Samuel goes to Saul and says, if only you had been obedient to the Lord, then the Lord would have established your reign. But because you have disobeyed, now your reign will not endure. And I think a big part of David's sadness is the reality of what could have been. If only Saul had obeyed, things would have looked very different. Now the beauty and the glory of Israel lies slain on the mountainside. And David says, how the mighty have fallen. Well, the second thing, not only the mighty have fallen, but David reflects on a nation's loss, verses 22 to 24. You know, there is much that we could say about Saul. There's much to remember about Saul's life. And I guess for most of us, if we were to recall some of the big highlights of Saul's life, we would probably remember the negative. We would probably remember the bad things, the fact that he chased and pursued David for most of 1 Samuel. I'm sure we would recall how David had to escape, sometimes just by the skin of his life. I'm sure we remember time after time as Saul seemed to disobey God and not ever desire to turn back. But isn't it interesting? David doesn't choose to remember those things. Not once in this lament does David mention any of that. He has much reason to bring all those things up, but here in this moment, David chooses to remember the good that was lost. And he focuses here on three things. Now, we might be happy to remember Jonathan in these ways. We say, well, Jonathan was a good guy. There's so much good we could say about Jonathan. But what about Saul? Can we really say much about Saul? You see, for all of Saul's bad, David chooses to remember Saul at his best. It's actually how the narrator chooses to remember Saul. There at the end of 1 Samuel 31, Saul has just been slain. He's just fallen on his sword. We've been told that he's died there along with his armor bearer. And how does the narrator end 1 Samuel 31? With the one good act that not the one good act, the good act that the people of Jabesh Gilead did to Saul. They couldn't bear him being pinned up on a wall, humiliated for all to jeer at and laugh at. You see, the narrator focused on the one good thing, or one of the one good things that Saul did. How he showed favor to those people at Jabesh Gilead. And you see, the nation here had lost two things with the death of Saul. We've kind of covered it a little bit, but David goes into a bit more detail here in verse 22. They were mighty warriors. They were great men. Many times, Saul and Jonathan had been victorious. They had had many victories over their enemies. And that's what we see in this imagery here in verse 22. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. See what David's saying? Saul and Jonathan had much victory. They had much successes as a warrior. Many times throughout 1 Samuel, we see occasions of great courage, of great leadership, of many battles that were won. And so David says the sword of Saul did not return empty. But Jonathan too, he was a remarkable warrior. Remember there in 1 Samuel chapter 14 with Jonathan's victory over those Philistines. What do those Philistines say? Here come those Hebrews. And they cry out to them, come up. We'll teach you a few things. And Jonathan there and his armor bearer are there at the bottom as they call them up. And what does Jonathan say? He says, follow me. And they wipe them out. And so David says the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. Now, of course, we know, as we know the story in full, that this is not a complete picture of Saul's life. This is not a balanced account of Saul's life. But you see, David knew that death was the time to recognize that which has been lost and that which might have been. You know, it's an important lesson for us, isn't it, in grief? When we attempt to put our grief into words, which we should, it is very appropriate, isn't it, to focus on the good that has been lost. Maybe we even say, on what might have been. See, David's grief is grounded in the good that has been lost. Well, the second thing that the nation have lost is the fact that they were loved people. Now, we might be very, very surprised by that description of Saul. Can we really say that Saul was loved? I mean, we get that Jonathan was loved and pleasant, but Saul? Well, again, it's not a complete truth about Saul's life, but it is where Saul started. He did begin by being loved by his people. The people did, at the very beginning, rejoice in many of his triumphs. Don't forget that favor that he showed to the people of Jabesh Gilead. You know, Saul at times was loved by the people. And even in his death, we see that kind and thoughtful act by those people of Jabesh Gilead. See, Saul was loved. Jonathan was loved. But not only that, David also, interestingly, speaks about the relationship between Saul and Jonathan. And isn't it interesting how he explains their relationship? What does he say? Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their life, and in their death they were not divided. And we say, well, that's a load of rubbish. Most of Saul and Jonathan's life seemed to be depicted by the fact that they were divided. But you see, David didn't choose to remember those moments. David chose to remember their relationship as being that of being united. Well, how do we explain that away? How do we make sense of that? Because David would have known Saul's attempts on Jonathan's life. David would have known the tensions that existed so often between them. But Jonathan remained faithful to his son despite all those things. And we know that Jonathan was devoted to David. Jonathan even helped David escape. He was part of that plan to escape from his father. And yet, isn't it interesting that not once did Jonathan ever betray his father? Not once did Jonathan abandon his father. And we see that there in 1 Samuel 31. Jonathan died alongside his father Saul. Jonathan could have quite easily said, well, I'm not going to fight alongside my father. I'm going to go and fight with David. Jonathan died at his side. And David wanted Israel to remember and to understand that in their death, despite all that had gone on, they were united. David weeps, and he wants all of Israel to weep with him for what was lost. Because that tragedy on the hillside was a mighty loss for Israel. Well, the third thing, there in verses 25 to 27, and that is David's personal loss. Not only was the death of Saul and Jonathan a loss for the nation, but it was a personal loss for David. And it's interesting, actually, this lament takes a slightly different direction at this point. We begin with that familiar phrase, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle, and we think, well, in some ways, the lament could have finished there. We could have drawn a line under it, and that could have been the end of David's lament. But David doesn't. Look at what he says following that line. This is David expressing and directing his grief in a really powerful way. Here in this lament, from this point onwards, there are two things that happen that are different from the rest of the lament. Firstly, David expresses this in the first person. All the way through, it's not been. Now, verse 26, I am distressed for you. You have been pleasant to me. Your love to me was wonderful. David expresses this lament in a deeply personal way, and he brings it into the first person. And secondly, Jonathan is now singled out on his own. All the way through this lament, and often during 1 Samuel, Jonathan is referred to as Saul's son. David began this lament by saying he grieves and he laments for Jonathan, Saul's son. There, halfway through, he brings Saul and Jonathan alongside each other and brings them together as a unified block of people. And now Saul is no longer mentioned. Rather, David says, I am distressed for you, my brother, Jonathan. You see, David is just expressing his grief now in a deeply personal way. And really, as you look at this last section of this text, it almost reads as if David is speaking directly to Jonathan. Even though we know Jonathan is dead, David almost writes this as if he's speaking to Jonathan. And it's interesting to notice the difference between verse 19 and verse 25. Verse 19, the beauty or the glory of Israel is slain on your high places. And look here at verse 25b, Jonathan was slain in your high places. See what's happened there? The beauty and the glory section has been replaced by the word Jonathan. In other words, I think what David is saying is, I'm not doing any injustice to Saul, but Jonathan was the beauty of Israel. Jonathan was the glory of Israel. He was the future heir to the throne. And here we don't get the reference to Saul, but we get the reference to Jonathan, David's brother. Now, we've known for a long time, haven't we, of David and Jonathan's friendship. We've seen it played out in action. We've seen them together. We remember that last time that they met, what happened as they made that covenant together. We read that Jonathan and David wept. It was the last time they would see each other, but the narrator tells us that David wept the most. Such was their relationship, such was the depth of their friendship. But you see, as David calls Jonathan his brother, it's more than just this personal buddy. It's more than just a deep friendship. This goes way beyond that. This goes and relates to their covenant relationship they had, the covenants they had made together. You remember, Jonathan loved David, the future coming king. Jonathan was the first to give up his rightful heir to the throne. in favor of David. And David, towards the end, made that commitment to Jonathan that he would care for Jonathan and he would care for his family. And Jonathan, you remember, on that last occasion said, I will stand alongside you in your kingdom. And all of that pictured together doesn't even begin to really flesh out what David means by brother, but it starts to paint that picture of the deep relationship they had. Jonathan and David are soulmates, and Jonathan's death crushes David. We read there, it distresses him. And this is David expressing that relationship that they had. By the way, there is not a hint of sexual love in this text. So many people use this as a description of to say this was somehow a sexual relationship that they had. If we read it in that way, and if we understand it and explain it in that way, then we do the text a great injustice. We do the relationship that they had together a deep injustice. Because we know, don't we, that David loved women. That was David's problem. He loved women too much. And here is David saying, as he expresses his covenant love and relationship with Jonathan, that this wonderful and very pleasant relationship that existed was even more important to him than the most cherished of human love he could experience. The love that he would have for a woman. And David says, how the mighty have fallen, and how the weapons of war have perished. See, David takes us back. This is the reason for this lament, that the mighty have fallen in tragic ways. There is good that has been lost. For the people have fled. Many are dead. And so is Saul and Jonathan. So what can we take from this lament in the final few minutes that we're just going to spend on this text? What can we take from this lament of David? Well, firstly, I think we can take from this lament the need to learn to grieve well. I think that's clear, isn't it? We said at the beginning, grief is a very appropriate response to the death of a loved one. And Christians, above all people, should know how to grieve for the loss of a loved one. Because we know that death is unnatural. Death was never meant to be. And so we grieve because it is the last, final, great enemy that we will face. And we grieve for what has been lost. We grieve perhaps for what could have been. And we grieve because the pain of death is real. And it never goes away. Of course, if our loved one is a Christian, we do rejoice. We do need to rejoice that for them, they are in a better place. Those who are absent from the body are to be home with the Lord, which is better by far. And of course, we say, yes, we rejoice in that. But let's never make that a reason to not grieve here on earth. For we know, don't we, that we have a sure and certain hope. That if we belong to Christ, death is not the end. We know that. But as we sang in that first song, we do have a wondrous story. We are part of a wondrous story. Jesus has died. Jesus has had the victory over death. But in the meantime, days of darkness still come over us. And sorrow's path we often tread. And therefore, it is very appropriate to grieve that which has been lost. You know, the truth is, a day will come when we will all say goodbye to a loved one. We don't know when, we don't know who. Maybe you already have lost a loved one. A mom, a dad, a husband, a wife, a brother, a sister, a friend. Maybe even, I hope not, but maybe even a child. And in that moment, and maybe if you've experienced it, you know what I'm talking about. In that moment, how will you come to terms with it? How will you grieve? How will you cope? See, David's lament teaches Israel and it teaches us how to grieve well. In fact, the whole Bible teaches us that, doesn't it? The whole Bible is full of lament. Therefore, it is a very appropriate response to death. It's a very appropriate way to express our grief. we need to know how to grieve well. Secondly and finally, David's lament teaches the direction to which our lament and our grief should go, the direction in which it should take us. You see, David's lament prepares for the next king. We see something of that in Jonathan's relationship with David. David would be a better king than Saul. And Jonathan's love was for that coming king. And you see, as we grieve, we have a better king than David, a better king than Solomon. And in our grief, in the pain that death brings, in the loss that death leaves, we ask ourselves the question, where do we turn? Well, we turn to our better king. We turn to Jesus, who is the death-defeating, the risen and ascended king. And one day he's coming back. You see, death could not hold Jesus. The grave could have no victory over Jesus. And so we say Jesus already had the victory. And one day death will be destroyed once and for all. You see, as we come to Jesus, we can look death in the face and we say with great confidence, where, O grave, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Because eternity has been won for me by heaven's eternal King. And so Saul's death asks us the question, are you ready to die well? To which we only say you can only die well if you hope in Jesus. And David's lament reminds us that grief is that appropriate response to death. The pain of death is real, but as we grieve, we are taken beyond the grave as we look to Jesus. And that promise that a day is coming when every tear will be wiped away. There'll be no more grief. Why? Because death will be no more. There is hope beyond the grave. There is an end to all of our grief. Because Jesus says, behold, I am making all things new. Father, help us this morning to know how to grieve well. And Lord, as we grieve, maybe we're grieving this morning, help us to direct our focus, not dismissing the pain that death brings, but turning our hearts to Jesus, the better King. Help us to believe and to trust that one day you are coming back, and on that day you will make everything new. Help us to long for that day. In Jesus' name, amen. Through all life's sorrows